Sup? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. You can buy most of that shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there.
Hello all. Feeling a bit self-conscious. It's been both a hard and a good couple of weeks, I suppose. Some people have been very supportive and nice. Others less so before that. And if there's one thing guaranteed to make me more self-conscious than insults and hatred, it is support and compliments. So there you go. I'm also still in a process of adjustment when it comes to tabletopless and people with no filter passing judgment. Usually it must be said in a complimentary way. On my appearance. So yeah, I don't feel particularly comfortable being on camera, and I'm sorry I haven't really done much in the way of videos lately. That's a result of this self-consciousness. So hopefully you'll enjoy the various pirate-themed images playing in the background as we talk about 7th Sea, which is a role-playing game of swashbuckling adventure. That was put out some years ago originally, and here I'm talking about the first edition and maybe a little bit about the second edition rather than the later ones, because as with Legend of the Five Rings, which I think was also Alderac Entertainment, the earlier editions are just better. They're more complete games. The first editions, well, this is something I often find with first editions of any game, is that they contain the enthusiasm and just the energy and the style that hooks you into the game, that makes it interesting for you, that clearly makes it interesting for the authors. And then anything past the third edition tends to be exploiting, almost. That's not quite the right word, but producing stuff for the sake of producing stuff, when you could just revise and update the older edition, by and large. Often first editions contain game-breaking rules issues, so second editions, maybe have a point, less so these days, I would say. And of course this doesn't apply to things like Dungeons and Dragons, for example, which leave a nice big gap between various editions of that game. Or they have different subversions, and I'm getting off track. Anyway, we're talking about 7th Sea, and I'm really talking about the first edition. This is a swashbuckling game that combines musketeers, pirates, Elizabethan England, really kind of the unification of Germany in a lot of ways, and somehow manages to cram in Vikings there as well. So it is a game of swashbuckling and sorcery, piracy and adventure, diplomacy and intrigue, archaeology and exploration. And indeed, that is pretty much how the game book is set up, to explore those various aspects of the game. In some ways it's a bit hackneyed, in other ways it isn't. You go into it thinking that you're going to be getting a purely pirate game, but you also get some sorcery and magic. You get some intrigue and spying and so on. You could really just call it an extended Age of Sail game, I suppose. And it spans a very long period of time in the real world and kind of compresses it all together to make the game world hyper-real, to make it mythologized and crammed together and almost overwhelming version of that same period by having everything happen all at once. The Spanish Inquisition, the Golden Age of Elizabethan England, the trading empire of the small city-states in Italy. You've got both the Dutch expansion of trade intermingled with Scandinavian Vikings and Russia at a point of sort of imperial might in a lot of ways as well. So yeah, it's very rooted in Europe, which might be a little bit disappointing for people wanting to recreate more of a Pirates of the Caribbean sort of world. Though there is mention of the New World and there are pirate islands and so on, so it's not neglected, but if you go into this thinking piracy, you might be a bit disappointed, because in some ways it's more almost Napoleonic, with the various manoeuvring between the different nations and factions and the beginnings of the great game of spying. But it is very rooted in Europe, more rooted in Europe than you might think if you go into it thinking about pirates. One hackneyed element that I don't especially like, but which you might like if you're into certain books that sort of cover the same sort of territory as this, is that there was an ancient civilization of some kind. The ancient ones, their ancient civilization was hidden away. They leave artifacts and devices and lost cities and so on. So that gives you the exploration, almost Atlantean side of things, if you want to bring that in. But in many ways it's the least engaging part of the game, and you can ignore it entirely if you want to. In terms of factions, detailed in the main book, you have Avalon, which is an analogue for Elizabethan England and is kind of intimately tied together with the world of fairy. You have Castile, which is an analogue for Spain, and probably to a lesser extent Portugal, and their imperial ambitions and rivalries with other imperial powers, and also very much fitting into the Spanish Inquisition and the sort of mishmash of nobility that Spain has had for much of its history. You have Eisen, which is an analogue for Germany, or more properly Prussia, I would say. They have access to this metal Drakensteel, if I remember correctly, that is virtually indestructible, and so they have whole fighting styles and so on connected to this metal, and their country is pretty much a wasteland, which helps explain and excuse their more imperial ambitions that they might have. There's Montaigne, which is an analogue for France, very much Three Musketeers, Man in the Iron Mask sort of territory, and a lot of rivalry with Castile and spying and so on going on there. You have Usura, which is an analogue for Russia, a frozen land of harsh people, harsh winters, and harsh magic. You have the Vendel, which is an analogue for Vikings, but it's also an analogue for the Nordic and Dutch traders that had a lot of mercantile power and so on. So you have this... Vikings doesn't necessarily fit with the rest of it, but it does create this interesting tension between the modernizing elements within the world, which is the more sort of trading side, and the more traditionalist side of things, which is the more Nordic Viking side. So it's interesting, but it's a little hard to justify in the sense of the rest of the world. I think it needed a bit more work, certainly in the earlier editions. You have the Vodacce, who are an analogue for the sort of principalities and powers of Venice at the time of the merchant princes, but Vodacce is much bigger and more powerful, but it is also rife with intrigue and has the most interesting magic users in the setting, the Vodacce Fate Witches, who are very interesting. Another aspect which you might be familiar with from certain fiction set in the same sort of aspects is secret societies play quite a big role in the game. You may well be a member of a secret society, analogues to the Illuminati or various other groups from history, and they might set you missions and set you on task, and this membership of a secret society helps to justify and to build alliances across the different nations, which is otherwise something that would be quite difficult within the game. So unless you're playing a band all from the same country, or a pirate crew who can come from all different countries, then secret societies is a good way to bring your players together. The system uses dice pools, sort of. Your handfuls of dice, and you total them, keeping only a certain number of them. So you might roll 5 dice and keep 3. More dice is more chances, more kept dice equals a higher total. The average target number is 15. So you keep dice equal to your trait, and you get a raise for every 5 points over the total target. So you might use that to do called shots, or do more damage, or invoke particular magical effects, and so on. The astute amongst you will have noticed that this works very similarly to the old Legend of the Five Rings system, and indeed, despite them all having different names and different application, you can make these two games compatible, and indeed we did. It's just one person might be rolling their ring plus their skill, and you would be rolling your statistic plus your skill, and they needn't necessarily interrelate to one another, but you can cross-compare. So if you want to include aspects of maybe European adventurers or explorers washing up on the shores of Rokugan, you can certainly do that with the older editions. I think that stops being the case probably by 3rd edition, if I'm remembering correctly. Rolling 10s on the dice, you roll d10s, makes you keep rolling and adding on, so you can get a more explosive result. Initiative is quite interesting, though I'm not sure I like it that much, but initiative has a dual effect. It gives you the phases you act on and a total for how quickly you act. So it's a combination of the number of actions that you can take and how quick on the uptake you are for taking those actions. As a lot of games have from this same sort of period, there's an emphasis on fictionalized action movie action, swashbuckling action. So enemies come in 3 types: mooks, henchmen, and villains, which is very dramatic and cinematic, and it's something I certainly appreciate when it comes to genre emulation. As I said earlier, the period in which this is set runs anything from the 1500s through the 1700s, even perhaps as late as the early 1800s, at the extremes of the kind of clockwork science and so on that you might see within the game, depending which direction you want to take it. It's a bit spotty, the technology. The technology is all over the place. It's not quite as advanced as it could be. There's no rifling, for example, on firearms. There are monsters, but monsters are relatively rare and should probably be the focus of a whole adventure. Otherwise, you're mainly going to be competing with other human forces. As I mentioned before, fairy is quite influential over Avalon, and different kinds of magic, cultural magic, and different kinds of magic users are spotted all over the world. Characters are created by their country, or culture I suppose you could say, their traits, their backgrounds, their merits, their flaws, their skills, their sorcery, where appropriate, and you can then further customize your character by taking on sword schools or particular schools of magic. Skills are quite broad, general areas of capability, but you can then specialize them with sub-skills, which are called knacks. So you might be good at melee fighting, but you might have a knack for using a cutlass, or a saber, or just a sword generally, I suppose, you might say. This is slightly unnecessarily complicated, though it does create more characterful characters. Just can slow things down a fair bit. On top of everything else, you get an Arcana card, a tarot card, that helps define your character's personality, their virtues, and their hubris, which help guide the role-playing side of the character and provide you with certain benefits or penalties, depending how that all works out. You also get drama dice, which give you buy-ins to allow you to shift dice rolls and to alter fate in the game, to move things in certain ways, and this is basically from the beginning of the whole story game's way of going about things, so there's an element of introducing new story elements or invoking your special backgrounds, and you're changing the play of the game, so you do need to be a fairly improvisational games master to run this successfully. Ship creation and design is quite detailed, but it doesn't really work for me. It's too quick, the ships are too vulnerable, and the system is too unwieldy compared to the other systems and subsystems within the game. If you want a sailing game that really does bring out the character of the ships, I would suggest that you look to something like Beat to Quarters, which is an Age of Sail / Napoleonic game with an infantry companion. If you want to play something like Sharp's Rifles, those two together make for the beginnings of a very strong Napoleonic game world. But it's a little bit lackluster in 7th Sea, and I think this is a problem that a lot of games run into, trying to operate at different scales. Fate accomplishes it to a degree, but by being so simple that so many of these things don't make any difference. Traveller kind of accomplishes it by being insanely complicated, particularly if you look to Traveller New Era and Fire Fusion and Steel, which tries to apply real-world physics and calculations to your game world. So that's another way of going about it. But most games struggle, I think, because most games, quite rightly, concentrate on the interpersonal scale. People fighting people, small skirmish level actions, 5 or 6 antagonists versus 5 or 6 players, and so struggle with vehicles. One of the few games I think that can really handle this in an effective way is Silhouette, which was designed from the start to be scalable from war game down to a more interpersonal sort of standard issue RPG, and I don't think it's been particularly rivaled when it comes to games. That said, 7th Sea does handle mass battles very well in a similar way to the way earlier editions of Legend of the Five Rings does, and it's fairly narrative, but you feel involved. There are events in battles, and it helps you feel embedded as a character, personalized as a character, with your interactions having an effect on the broader flow of battle without compromising too much in any one or other direction. So that's a definite plus point for it. This is an older book. It was not printed in full colour. There were colour plates and so on. In terms of style, I did love the illustrations in the older edition, and they did very definitely evoke the setting, particularly those colour plates that I mentioned. I think because back then a lot more effort and art direction would have gone into the more expensive full colour pieces, less so in the black and white, but it oozes character. It just doesn't quite necessarily fulfill the impression that it's trying to give you. So for style, I would say 4 out of 5. In terms of substance, the first edition really has everything you need. You can always add to it yourself. The older books, I think they're available on Drive-Thru-RPG if you wanted all the expanded material. In terms of substance, though, the main book has everything you need, so I would say 4 out of 5. It could have used a few more bits and pieces, a little bit more guidance for the games master and the players, a few more tools for making things a bit quicker. So that's 4 out of 5 for style, 4 out of 5 for substance, 8 out of 10, 4 out of 5. I don't rate the newer editions particularly, whether it's Legend of the Five Rings or 7th Sea, but the older edition still certainly has a great deal of charm, a great deal of enthusiasm, and that will help sell you on the game. So if you want to run something Pirates of the Caribbean-ish, I think 7th Sea is definitely a good choice. Zang. Postmortem Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com